Hello everyone. Welcome to the technical meeting of SMASH 2022. In this debate briefing, it's going to be quite short because we think most of you have been having your experiences with Asian debate parliamentary format. But for those of you who haven't, that is okay because that's what we are going to do. The Adjudication Court of SMASH 2022 is going to provide you the briefing for next day's round, and especially in the technicalities of the debate in and of itself. So what is Asian parliamentary format and how does it look like? So Asian parliamentary format is a type of debating which consists of two teams with 3 speakers in each team. One team representing government and the other team representing the team of opposition, and they oppose each other. This building time is 30 minutes, and each speaker will speak for 7 minutes and 20 seconds for substantive speech, in which the first until 6 minutes it opens to POI. The first minute and the last minute is protected from POIs, and 4 minutes as well as 20 seconds for reply speeches. Reply speaker should come from the first and second speaker, and the first team that provides the reply speech is the opposition team as opposed to the government team. And there would be motion preference that would be explained later in the presentation. So this is how the debate flows of Asian parliamentary system. Prime Minister or the first speaker of the government team is going to be responded by leader of opposition or the first speaker of the opposition team, and will be followed by deputies. The first team, which is the government team, will present Deputy Prime Minister case, and followed by deputies leader of opposition, and back and forth to the government whip, to opposition whip. But opposition reply is going to present the reply speech first, and the last speaker is the government reply speaker. So the team roles in Asian debating parliamentary format is there are 3 burdens here. Number 1, the logical burden, which is to elaborate the likelihood and the impact of your claims. You need to explain why is your argument true and what are the factors that would supplement your claims to be more solid. What are the impacts and why are they likely to happen? So in the motion of this house would ban fast food industry, and you want to present the argument that fast food industry needs to be banned because it creates a lot of bad things to the health of the consumers. You need to explain why this is true, why the health problems will arise from eating fast food industry's products, and what are the factors that could supplement your claims to be more solid. What are the types of diseases that you will have when you eat fast foods in and of itself, and what are the impacts and why they are likely to happen, why when you want to ban these fast food industries, there will be activity in the way that there will be no fast food industries in the future. You could explain that you are going to be punishing the corporations that still want to sell their fast food products after the motion has been enacted, or you're going to socialize the types of hazards to the individual's health if they remain to consume this fast food in and of itself. So that's the first logical burden. The second burden is on the motion-based burden, which is to address the key issues asked by the motion. Did you debate within the scope demanded by the motion? So if the motion is about as developing countries, this house would heavily prioritize the development of megacities, for example. So you need to explain why developing countries need to do this policy. You need to debate within the scope of developing countries, because it would just be nonsensical if you want to debate on the actors which are developed countries, because the motion has been explicitly stating that this is literally about developing countries. And the third burden is about the comparison or framing. You need to actively compare and weigh yourself with all the opponents' contribution. Why is your argument better than the opponents, and why it is more important than the opponents? So if your team wants to talk about the government mandate to collect taxes from the people, because that's when government can get money to provide social welfare to the populations, and the opposition want to reduce taxes in your opposition because they want to have more businesses coming in and becoming a more attractive nation for the foreign direct investment. They need to explain in the government team why collecting taxes and distributing welfare is something that is more important than attracting businesses in the side of opposition. So it goes beyond just general responses of A minus, why your opponent argument isn't true or why your opponent argument is illogical, but you need to also compare the best case scenario of the opposition, why even they can achieve the goal that they want to expect, their argument is still less important or less crucial to the debate in comparison to your team's case. So those are the three burdens in the debate that we hope you could fulfill. Now let's talk about the speaker rules. The first speaker, prime minister and leader of opposition. Just general disclaimer, there is no specific type of what you should do and what you should not do in the first speaker, second speaker, third speaker, and reply speech. There is no 100% absolute truth and absolute wrong in the way that you convey your speech. Because, if you are becoming the first speaker and you don't provide these things like stance and you only have few arguments, it does not automatically make you lose to the debate if your opposition does worse in comparison to your team. But these are just the general recommendation on what you should bring. If you never have any experiences in Asian debating parliamentary format, I think this will help you a lot because it will help you to structurize and strategize your speech in possibly the best way possible. So for the prime minister and leader of opposition, what you could do to make your speech becoming persuasive is to provide your stance, the team stance. Team stance means what is the issue that made the motion arises. Prime Minister, you could explain the definition of specific wording that might require further analysis or further contextualization within the debate. So if the motion is this House will prosecute political leaders that fail to fulfill their campaign promises, then you need to explain what does it mean to be prosecuted? What does it mean to be having prosecution to these political leaders? And what does it mean to not be able to fulfill their campaign promises? Is it about they just completely reject to bring these issues to the parliament? Or is it about these individuals already have their issues discussed in the parliament, but the motion still unable to be passed because of any other reasons? So you need to just really specify what is this thing that we talk about in this definition. And also, you could also talk about the root problems, why you need to solve these problems, why these problems is very urgent to be solved. So, there are a lot of problems in this world. You can talk about economic inequality, discrimination, environmental problems, corruption, and so on and so forth. But you need to talk about why this motion is required to solve these root problems. You could also talk about the background, what are the things that become the backdrop as to why this motion actually arise and being debated in the very first place. More than that, you could also add to this analysis by adding model. A model isn't always necessary to be brought as the first speaker, because if the motion is already clear enough to not require model, for example, in the motion of this House regrets cosmetic surgery, then it's already quite clear that you don't like to have cosmetic surgery to exist, and you just talk about the cons, the bad things that cosmetic surgery will imbue to individuals. But some motions require further modeling or setting up to make the debate gets clearer. So in the motion of this House, as Indonesian government would prioritize decentralization of economy, So you need to specify what does it mean to have economic decentralization and what Indonesian government should do to achieve this effective economic decentralization. Is it about redistributing taxes, or is it about developing rural areas? You could talk about a lot of things in your model. In leader of opposition, you may choose between one, sticking with the status quo, or number two, having modified or improved status quo. Number three, creating an entirely new proposal, or as we call it, counter proposal, to flip the case in government side. Again, it has to be mutually exclusive, because if you want to defend the status quo, it means that you cannot make entirely new proposal, because that's just antithesis to one another. So you have a lot of things to say. For example, going back to my previous example of this household and fast food industry, in opposition, you could say that number one, sticking with status quo, in which that it is not banned because there is no problem with having fast food industries to our society. Number two, you could have modified or improved status quo by adding, we don't need to ban fast food industry, but we need to have a government that socialize the impacts of consuming fast food industry, so people have informed consent when they consume this type of foods. Or number three, you can create an entirely new proposal that we don't want to ban fast food industry, but we want to make fast food companies pay their quote unquote fat tax. So for every product that they sell to people, they need to pay taxes to the government. So if people get sick because of this type of fast food, then government do have money to be provided to the healthcare system to cure or to pay for the medical fees of these individuals. So you could do this 1, 2, 3, just up to your strategy and consideration with your teammates. So that's the stance. In terms of the arguments, you need to start with what you believe to be the most valuable or important in the debate according to the motion. So just go to the most intuitive thing that you could explain. So for the example, in the motion of this house, believe that affirmative action brings more harm than good, then in the government side, we could talk about how affirmative action, the most intuitive thing to say, creates a narrative that minority individuals can only be alleviated when they get quote unquote help from the government, and that creates a perception that there is inferiority to the minority because otherwise they couldn't get help if government doesn't assist them to do so. So this harm to the perceptual narrative within society, I think is the most intuitive thing in the government side, and that's what I think you need to start your arguments with. In leader of opposition, you should respond to the prime minister on top of delivering new arguments. So yeah, responding, negating your opponent's case, proving analysis why your opponent's case is illogical is important, but you need to make your own arguments in and of itself. That's not obligatory, that's not mandatory. Some teams could win with just mere responses, but that would just be not strategic to your case, because if you just respond, and you don't have original arguments, then it's just easier for your opponent team to flip your response, and you don't need to be burdened with responding your original case. So you don't want to make your opponent to get easier win, or you don't want to make your opponent have easier time to respond to your entire case. So yeah, that's for the first speaker. For the second speaker of the deputies, again, there is no like rigid formula on what to do and what not to do in deputy speech, but these are just a recommendation. Obviously, you need to make a lot of responses. You need to provide key direct responses to the opposing team. So you respond their original case, but you need to respond their refutation to your first speaker's case. So consolidating and strengthening your first speaker's speech is also important alongside with response. Yeah, the way that you can strengthen your team is to provide additional argument to support or oppose a motion. ideally something that your previous speaker hasn't established. So oftentimes in debate, the judges give you an input that your speech was too repetitive. Being too repetitive means that you just reiterate or just reclaim what your first speaker has been saying. You don't want to do that because that doesn't contribute anything new to the debate. That doesn't expand your team's case, and that's just not something that you want to do. You may add additional layers or points to support your teammates' explanation. So if your first speaker's case already discussed the economic dimension of the motion, as the second speaker, you could talk about the political aspect, cultural aspects, or the international relation aspect of your case. A lot of things can be done in deputies. So yeah, that's it. For the whip speaker roles or the third speaker, you need to summarize and strengthen your previous speaker's case. Summary is just as important as response, especially if your conclusion can help the judge compare your team with the opponent. I just make sure that you map out the debate and give the best possible conclusion to the adjudicator. So the adjudicators think that, oh yeah, the speaker actually makes sense in the way that they make summary to the debate, concluding what the first speaker has been saying, what the second speaker has been saying, and why in the end the tipping point should go to your team's case. You may also provide additional explanations, characterizations, examples, as long as they still manifest the same conclusion laid out by your member to support their extensions. So no new matters. You cannot just make, I'm going to bring the fourth argument in my case, that will not be counted by adjudicators, but you could make something as a better layer in your speech to add up what has been explained by your previous speakers, by explanations, characterizations, examples, new framings, for example. Those are the things that you want to do. Responses are also important to provide with the key and final responses to the previous speaker, as you are literally the last person that can do that. So government whip, make your best response to the leader of opposition, and opposition whip, make the best response to the government whip. You may also structure your response in a way that summarizes the comparison between your team and the opponent. So maybe you could put a lot of your responses in points of clashes. You could elaborate to the adjudicators that there are three clashes in this debate. Number one, is it going to be economically better for the government to make this policy? Number two, is this going to be politically strategic for the nation to do this? Number three, international relation impact. And then you summarize all of the things that your first and second speaker has been explaining in response to the opponent's first and second speakers, and explain why, after all of this consideration, your team is still on the upper hand, because either you provide the best contextualization, you have responded to a lot of cases provided by your opponent, or you just make clear characterization to the debate. This comparison is important in the third speaker. And last speaker roles, replies, you need to provide bias adjudication regarding to the debate. To do that, you could address these several questions. Number one, why your team should win the debate. Definitely the reason probably because a lot of arguments are still not responded by your opponent, or you've already responded to your opponent's case, or you provide a clearer relevancy to the motion in comparison to your opponent. The second thing that you could probably address is what is the matrix of the judgment. If you think that your team wins on the principal argument, then you might want to say that why principal argument is the most important element to be considered within the debate in comparison to practical consequences that probably your opponent team has better explanation on. The third thing that you want to address is why your team's argument is the most important. You could explain why. Again, explaining why the argument that you explain in the motion of this house would increase tax As opposition, you might want to say that not increasing tax means that you might attract more businesses to come to your country. That means more job vacancy. That means more product services being provided to individuals. And why this is important and more important in comparison to your opponent case that want to increase tax, that the benefit is only to have more budget to the government. And so you compare the quantity and the quality of the benefits that you provide as your team in comparison to what has been presented by your opponent. More than that, you could also explain why your team's response is the strongest. Maybe you want to elaborate that you provided the A minus, the negation. You can also provide the even if. You also have provided response in terms of framing and weighing, and why these types of responses secure you the VP in the round. Lastly, could also touch the metrics of what are the crucial problems of your opponent's case. Maybe you can explain that their argument is too jumpy. They don't provide believable likelihood, or they don't provide a model that makes the debate messy, and just point out all of these problems to the adjudicators. So that's the speaker rules. Next, let's talk about the motion types. The first motion type is policy. Usually the wording is this House would. The House here is the parliament of the state. So in this case, you need to focus on whether or not the policy should be implemented. Usually it's not about why X brings more harm than good or otherwise, but why the value achieves a specific threshold to compel the actor to do something. So just go to the example, this House would ban private universities. So you might talk a lot about why private universities are bad because it overclouds the state-funded universities, and it is quite expensive. You could talk about a lot of these harms, but that's not the only thing that you need to explain. The most important thing that you need to consider is to elaborate to the adjudicators why all of those bad things that become the consequences of having private universities necessitate government to ban these private universities. So why the threshold of these bad things compel the actor, which is the government or the state, to ban those things in the very first place. These type of policy motion require a certain modeling or ways to implement this. So in this motion, you could talk about we're going to be punishing possible actors that still want to create private universities after the motion has been enacted. Number two, we're going to aggressively increase the development of state-funded universities, so opposition couldn't run away and just simply say that state-funded university is not enough, because we are going to increase the quantity of state-funded universities. Number three, you could explain that the current private university students that already enroll themselves in these type of universities are going to have their credits transferred to state-funded universities, so they don't have to add more years, and it's going to be done through government supervision. Everything will be smooth because they could just simply credit transfer their way into the state-funded universities after this motion has been passed. So that's the first type of motion. The second type of motion is analysis. Usually the wording is this House believe that, this House oppose, and this House support. It requires you to assess whether the value of certain element, item, object, etc. is more positive or negative from a neutral observer's perspective. Most of the time, it doesn't ask for logical or feasibility requirement. So example, this House believe that private universities bring more harm than good. You don't have a burden to explain that why, as the consequences of having more harm than good of private universities, you need to ban private university. You don't also need to be explaining why the world without private university is going to be a better world than a world when they have these private universities. You just need to explain why all of those harms that you explain as the product of private universities outweigh the possible good that your opponent might address. The second example is this: how support the abolishment of private universities. So yeah, in this type of motion, it's more similar to the policy motion type in comparison to this House belief that type of motion. But the difference is, in this motion of this House support the abolishment of private universities, you don't need to have a lot of modeling. You just need to explain that assuming feasibility, that we need to support the abolishment of private universities, that would just be a better condition, a better scenario than a world in which that you don't support or you condone the existence of private universities. The third type of motion is the regrets motion. Regrets motion should be assessing whether the world would be a better place with or without the thesis stated in the motion. The themes have a benefit of hindsight. It means that retrospectively, looking into what has happened so far, why this thing that we debate upon needs to be regretted or be supported. So the motion is probably, just use the example, this House regret the prevalence of private universities in Indonesian educational ecosystem. So you could look back in time since the conception of private universities in Indonesian educational institution and explain why in the previous decades since the conception of private universities, the educational institution has been going into a good direction or a bad trajectory to the education overall. So it's about evaluating what has happened so far. The government team is then expected to provide an antithesis of that world wherein such element does exist. So you need to picturize, portray in the world when the prevalence of private universities isn't that much, then what happened? Probably you could explain that state-funded universities will have more domination, and that means a good thing because government has better control to the curriculum. Or in opposition, you could explain that the prevalence, looking back evaluatively, is a good thing because if we don't have private universities, then people don't have access to education because state-funded institution is still inaccessible and the quantity isn't that much in a lot of rural, underdeveloped areas in Indonesia. The government team cannot create the antithesis as they need to explain the likelihood of such antithesis. So when you want to regret the prevalence of private universities and explain that without the prevalence of private universities, you have more state-funded universities, that is just an assertion. You need to explain why that is likely to happen. Probably you could explain if you don't have a lot of private universities, then there will be more political demand and more push to the government and the educational ministry to increase the access through state funding in the universities that are non-private, and that can only happen when there is no alternative and they couldn't just simply delegate and shift their responsibility to private actors. So those are the types of likelihood that you want to explain. The third, I think I lose count, but I lose the number. The next motion type is preverse. Preverse motion of this House preverse should be about the extent of which the statement is true, considering the elements being discussed or stated in the motion. Considering this type of motion usually follows with a world in which the opposition team cannot provide an alternate new world. So you couldn't make your own counter proposal because the debate should be about A versus status quo as opposed to A versus B, assuming status quo is not B. Variation of this motion includes an explicit reference to A is more preferred than B. Therefore, the opposition team needs to define B and only B. It couldn't be C, it couldn't be D, or any other numbers, any other letters. I'm sorry. Example is this house prefers a world in which the educational system is entirely run by the state. So you need to compare why a world in which the educational system is entirely run by the state is a better world than the status quo, because that's what you want to prevent. A world that is new because of this motion rise versus the current world that we live in right now. The current world that we live in right now is educational system is a mix between private and state run. So opposition couldn't make an entirely new counter proposal by explaining that we prefer a world in which the educational system is entirely run by the private actors. You couldn't say that. You couldn't have that stance because that would violate the essence of the motion. Because what you need to defend is the current world, not the new other world that opposition wants to portray. Other motion type is actor. So there will be as blah 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 this house would slash this house believe that slash etc. The debate is on whether or not the motion is true from the perspective of the stated actor, not from a neutral perspective. So teams must consider the stipulated actor's knowledge, value, interest, as well as principle in regards with the motion. So example is as public universities, this house would actively call for the abolishment of private universities. So you need to evaluate and assess the knowledge of private universities, the values of private universities, and the interest of the knowledge, values, and interests of public universities in regard with the motion. So maybe the interest of public universities is to expand the access of education, is to have more students to be enrolled, is to have more faculties and majors being more accessible to people on the ground. So that's the interest. You couldn't just run away from this motion by making this is coming from the neutral third perspective, or making the perspective should come from the Indonesian government, or making the perspective of the general society, because that's not the debate. You need to only talk in the perspective of the public universities. Next definition. So definition is expected to be delivered by teams to debate at the level of generality implied in the motion. If no specificity is stated, then please to assume the debate takes place in any functional democracy. So teams can definitely exclude fringe anomalous example or define a detailed mechanism to implement the motion if deemed necessary. So, for example, in the motion of this house believe that social media should not be censored, then there is no specificity in that motion. It's not about whether Chinese government need to censor social media or whether Indonesian government need to censor social media, because it's general. This house believe that social media should not be censored. Then in this motion, you need to assume that the debate takes place in functional democracy. So you couldn't say that, oh, state is going to be violating this mechanism and will make sure there is no criticism against government through the means of censorship. That's not something that you want to be capitalizing on. You need to talk about why even functional democracy, if given ability to censor social media, the outcome is more harm than good. However, you can define a detailed mechanism to implement the motion if deemed necessary. So you could explain that in some circumstances in which the government is not entirely democratic, then this type of harms of Chinese government, Indonesian government, Iran government is going to be utilizing this censorship means for political goals. However, it is illegitimate to include only fringe or anomalous example to support your case. You couldn't just make a limitation to the debate that in the motion of this house believe that social media should not be censored, simply saying that, oh, this motion is talking about the perspective of Indonesian government, or we only talk about censorship that censors pornography. you couldn't make that type of specificity or fringe or anomalous examples to support your case. You could restrict the debate to a very specific setting without strong justification. You couldn't do that. You couldn't also propose a mechanism that is not in line with the spirit of the motion or squirreling. So if the motion is this house as United Nations will send peacekeeping troops to Afghanistan, for example, then you couldn't propose a mechanism that is not in line. For example, we are going to weaponize these United Nations to kill Taliban, for example. You couldn't do that because it's literally peacekeeping motion. Definitional challenge. If the opposition teams believe that the definitions set by the government is illegitimate, then you can do definitional challenge. It has to be done by the leader of opposition in clear and explicit manner. Sorry. So yeah, but this can only be done when there is strong justification and teams are expected to still engage on the main premises using the original definition. And it should be the last resort than the first line of defense against poorly defined motion. So it only on the extreme emergency scenario. For example, if the motion is as United Nations that we should send peacekeeping to Afghanistan, then UN is United Nations. It's not unclear nation, for example. That's not what UN should be defined as. And if that's the case, that you could do definitional challenge. Fiat. So fiat means government might assume that the motion will pass in the parliament. So if the motion is this house would ban fast food industry, then opposition couldn't say that. But this motion will not be passed by parliament. Therefore, there is no ban on fast food industry, because if that's the case, then there will be no debate. Therefore, arguments about whether the parliament will pass the motion is not acceptable. In cases in which the opposition team provides a mutually exclusive counter proposal, the fiat also applies. But for example, if government say that we want to ban the fast food industry, meanwhile opposition say that we want to only increase taxes to fast food industry, then the fiat that opposition wants to have should also apply. Motion preference. So motion preference is going to be used in SMASH 2022. How does this look like and how does this work? So just look into these examples. We are going to ban or not use the least prioritized or the least favored motions from both teams. So for example, look at the left side. Government is choosing the first motion as the most prioritized, second motion as the second prioritized, number 3 as the least prioritized. And while opposition wants to prioritize the most, the third motion, and second motion as the second prioritized, and the first motion as the least prioritized motion. The least prioritized motions from both teams are the third motion of government and the first motion of opposition. So the third motion and first motion will not be debated, and we will have the middle ground, which is the second motion. So second motion is going to be debated. In the second example, look at the right side, the government first prioritize the first motion the most, second motion is going to be prioritized second, and the third motion is prioritized the least. Opposition wants to prioritize the second motion at first priority, first motion to be preferred as the second prioritized motion, the third motion as the least priority. In this type of example, the third motion is the least prioritized by government and opposition. So in this scenario, then the third motion obviously will not be debated, but whether first or second motion to be the one to be debated is subject to coin toss. So coin toss, I think coin toss is going to be you need to make your own coin toss. So maybe you can do screen sharing and just go to coin toss in Google search and click that website and screen share to the Zoom. And you need to ask your opponent whether they choose head or tail. And after that, you just need to coin toss. And if you choose head, and head is the one that come out as the result of the coin toss, then your first preferred motion should be used. So if government choose heads and opposition choose tail, and the coin toss result into tail, then opposition first priority motion, which is the second motion, is going to be used. But if the coin toss results into head, then the government priority, because government choose head, the first motion as the first priority of the government side is going to be used in the debate. Other important information can be inquired into contact person this. So you screenshot, save them to your contact Indisa, Marsha, or the line of Smash 2022 or the Instagram. Okay, thank you and see you in the competition. We really hope you to enjoy the competition and do your best and be the best.